The ship landed on the platform with a soft hum, and Kira-chan stepped out into the bright light of 3 suns that hung in the purple sky above her head. And she took a deep breath of air that smelled like nothing she had ever known before. A mix of flowers and metal and something sweet that she could not name. She was here at last, standing on the grounds of the Galactic Institute of Applied Sciences, the most famous school in all the known universe. And she was the only human who had ever been accepted into its advanced computational theory program, which made her feel both proud and terrified at the same time. Kira looked around at the massive buildings that rose into the sky like mountains made of glass and light, and she saw creatures of every shape and size walking along the paths between them, some floating through the air, some crawling on many legs, and some moving in ways that her human brain could not even understand. She was 23 years old, born on Earth in a small town called Pine Creek, and she had spent her whole life studying and dreaming of the stars, and now those stars were all around her, and the weight of what she had achieved pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. A floating drone appeared before her face and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear, telling her to follow it to her dormitory, and she did as it said, walking through crowds of alien students who turned to look at her with eyes of every color and shape. And she heard whispers in languages she did not know, but she understood the tone well enough. They were curious about her, and not in a kind way. Humans were new to the galaxy, having only discovered faster-than-light travel 60 years ago, which was nothing compared to species that had been sailing between stars for thousands or even millions of years. And Kira knew that many aliens saw her kind as primitive creatures who had barely crawled out of their caves. She reached her dormitory room, a small but comfortable space with a bed that adjusted to her body shape and a window that looked out over a garden filled with plants from 100 different worlds. And she sat down on the bed and let out a long breath that she had been holding since she stepped off the ship. Tomorrow would be her first day of class, and she would have to prove that she belonged here, that humans were not the stupid apes that everyone seemed to think they were. The next morning came faster than she wanted it to, and Kira woke up to the sound of chimes that filled her room with soft music. And she got dressed in the simple gray uniform that all students wore and made her way to the lecture hall where her first class would be held. The room was huge, with seats arranged in a circle around a central platform where the professor would stand. And Kira counted 47 other students already sitting in their places, representing species from across the galaxy. And every single one of them turned to look at her when she walked in. She found a seat in the back row and sat down, keeping her eyes forward and trying to ignore the stares and the whispers that followed her like shadows. A student sitting next to her was made entirely of crystal, her body catching the light and breaking it into rainbows that danced across the walls. And she leaned toward Kira and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "You are the human," she said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, and her tone carried a weight of judgment that Kira could feel in her chest. "I am," Kira replied, keeping her voice steady and calm even though her heart was beating fast inside her. "Interesting," the crystal student said, and then she turned away as if Kira was not worth any more of her time or attention. Before Kira could think of anything to say, the doors at the front of the room opened, and a creature walked in that made her breath catch in her throat. Professor Vrethkan was tall, taller than any being Kira had ever seen, with a body covered in hard black plates like armor, and 4 compound eyes that glittered like dark jewels in his head, and 2 long arms that ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. And he moved with the slow confidence of someone who had never been challenged in his entire life. He was an insectoid from a world called Vreth Prime, and he had been teaching at the Institute for over 200 years. And his reputation was known across the entire galaxy as one of the greatest minds in computational theory. The professor reached the central platform and stood there in silence for a long moment, his four eyes moving across the room and studying each student in turn. And when his gaze reached Kira, she felt a chill run down her spine. "Welcome to Advanced Computational Theory," he said, his voice deep and buzzing, translated by a small device attached to his chest. And his mandibles clicked together in what might have been amusement or might have been contempt. "I see we have a diverse cohort this year, including our first human student," he continued. And Kira felt every eye in the room turn toward her once again. And she sat up straighter in her seat and refused to look away from the professor. "Humans," Rethkon said, clicking his mandibles again, "are a young species, new to the stars, new to the ways of the galaxy, and I am curious to see what they can offer to our ancient traditions of learning." His tone made it clear that he expected the answer to be nothing at all. "But enough of introductions," the professor said, waving one of his clawed hands through the air. "Let us begin with something simple. A little test to see where each of you stands in your understanding of the fundamentals." He pressed a button on the platform, and a holographic display appeared in the air before him, showing a complex web of lines and nodes that twisted and turned in ways that made Kira's head hurt just to look at it. "This is a basic logic puzzle from the Varwan archives," Rethkon explained, "and I expect each of you to solve it within the next 10 minutes, which should be more than enough time for students of your supposed caliber." Kira stared at the puzzle, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the patterns before her. And she noticed the crystal student next to her had already closed her eyes and was humming softly as light pulsed through her body. The other students were doing similar things, each using their own species-specific abilities to tackle the problem. And Kira realized with a sinking feeling that she had none of those advantages. She was just a human with a human brain, and she wondered for the first time if coming here had been a terrible mistake. But then something strange happened, something that would change everything. As Kira stared at the puzzle, her mind stopped trying to calculate and started to really see. And the lines and nodes stopped being abstract concepts and became something familiar, something she recognized from her childhood. It looked like a game she used to play with her grandmother, a simple puzzle made of string and loops, and without thinking, Kira raised her hand and spoke the answer out loud. The room went silent, and Professor Vrethkan's four eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into her seat, and she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The silence in the lecture hall was so thick that Kira could feel it pressing against her skin, and every student had stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at her, with expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like anger. Professor Vrethkan stood very still on the central platform. His four compound eyes locked onto Kira, like she was some kind of strange bug that had crawled into his classroom by accident. And his mandibles clicked together in a rapid pattern that the translator could not or would not convert into words. "You," he said at last, his voice flat and cold, "solved the puzzle in 43 seconds, which is faster than any student in the history of this class has ever done. And I must ask you how." Kira felt her face grow hot with embarrassment and confusion, because she did not really know how to explain what had happened. And she opened her mouth to speak, but found that no words would come out. "It just looked like something I had seen before," she finally managed to say, her voice small and uncertain in the huge room. "A toy my grandmother used to have, and I remembered how to untangle it." The crystal student next to her made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a snort of disbelief. And several other students whispered to each other in their own languages. And Kira wished more than anything that she could sink through the floor and disappear. "A toy," Professor Vrethkan repeated, and his mandibles clicked in that strange pattern again. "You compared one of the most elegant logic puzzles ever created by the Volruan civilization to a toy. and somehow this allowed you to solve it in less than a minute." He stared at her for a long moment, and Kira could not tell if he was impressed or insulted or simply confused. And then he turned away and addressed the rest of the class. "It seems we have an interesting year ahead of us," he said. And there was something in his tone that made Kira's stomach twist with worry. "But let us not get ahead of ourselves, for that was merely a warm-up exercise." He pressed another button on the platform, and the holographic display changed, becoming something so complex and massive that it filled the entire center of the room. A three-dimensional maze of glowing lines and pulsing nodes and spinning shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt Kira's eyes to look at. "This," Professor Vrethkon announced, "is the Nexari problem." A gasp went through the room, and even the most composed students seemed to shift in their seats with something like fear or excitement. And Kira realized that whatever this thing was, it was very important and very difficult. The Nexari were an ancient species who lived and died long before most of your civilizations even existed, the professor explained, walking around the holographic display with his clawed hands clasped behind his back. And they were the greatest computational minds the galaxy has ever known. Masters of logic and mathematics who built wonders that we still cannot fully understand. He stopped and turned to face the class, and his four eyes seemed to glow with a strange light. Before they vanished from the universe, they left behind this puzzle, a challenge to all species who would come after them. And in the 10,000 years since its discovery, no one has ever found a complete solution. Kira felt her heart sink as she stared at the massive tangle of light and code floating before her, and she wondered how anyone could possibly make sense of something so complicated and alien. "There is no solution?" asked a student from somewhere across the room, a being made of what looked like living smoke that shifted and swirled as it spoke. "There are optimal approaches," Professor Vrethkon replied. "Ways to achieve certain levels of efficiency in navigating the problem. And the best score ever recorded was achieved by a Varuan master mathematician who spent 40 years of her life working on nothing else." He paused and let those words hang in the air, and Kira could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. "Your assignment," the professor continued, "is to achieve the highest efficiency rating you can manage in one standard week, which is 7 of your human days, Miss Chun." He looked directly at her as he said this, and Kira knew that he was testing her, waiting to see if the strange human who had solved his warm-up puzzle so quickly would crumble under the weight of a real challenge. "The student who achieves the highest rating will receive top marks and my personal recommendation for advanced study," Vrethkon said, "while the rest of you will learn a valuable lesson about the difference between luck and skill." The class was dismissed, and students began to leave the lecture hall, many of them already pulling out tablets and devices and neural interfaces to begin working on the problem immediately. The crystal student next to Kira stood up and looked down at her with eyes that sparkled like diamonds in sunlight. "Good luck, human," she said, and her voice was sweet but her words were sharp. "You will need it, because this is not a toy that your grandmother can help you with." And then she walked away, her crystalline body chiming softly with each step. And Kira was left alone in the back row of the empty lecture hall, staring at the holographic nightmare that still floated above the central platform. She walked down the steps toward it, moving slowly like she was approaching a wild animal that might attack at any moment. And she stood before the Nexari problem and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Logic gates, the tutorial notes said, connected by quantum probability nodes that existed in multiple states at once, linked together by recursive algorithmic loops that fed back into themselves in patterns that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Kira had studied computational theory for years, had earned the highest marks in every class she had ever taken on Earth, had impressed the selection committee enough to earn a place at the most prestigious school in the galaxy. But as she stood before this puzzle, She felt like a child trying to read a book written in a language she had never seen before. She walked around the hologram looking at it from different angles, and she noticed that some of the lines seemed to connect in patterns that almost made sense. But whenever she tried to follow them, they twisted away into chaos. Hours passed, and Kira did not notice. Lost in her attempts to understand even the smallest piece of the puzzle, and when she finally looked up, she saw that the suns had moved across the sky outside the windows, and the light in the room had changed from bright white to soft purple. She was exhausted and confused and more than a little scared, and she decided to go back to her room and get some rest and try again tomorrow with fresh eyes. But as she walked toward the door, something made her stop and turn back for one last look at the Nexari problem. And in that moment, with her tired eyes and her weary mind, she saw something that she had not seen before, a shape hidden within the chaos. A pattern that her brain recognized even if her conscious mind did not understand. "Huh," she said softly to the empty room. "That is strange." And she walked out into the purple twilight, not knowing that she had just taken the first step toward changing everything the galaxy thought it knew about humans and their place among the stars. Kira did not sleep well that night, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Nexari problem floating in the darkness of her mind, its lines and nodes dancing and twisting like living things. And when morning came, she felt more tired than she had the night before. She ate a quick breakfast in the student cafeteria, surrounded by aliens who did not look at her or speak to her. And then she made her way back to the lecture hall, determined to spend every moment of her week working on the problem. But when she arrived, she found that she was not alone. The hall was filled with students, all of them sitting in their seats with their eyes closed or their bodies glowing or their minds connected to strange devices that hummed with power. And each of them was working on the Nexari problem in their own way. The crystal student, whose name Kira had learned was Thessaly, was sitting in a meditative pose with light pulsing through her body in complex patterns. And Kira could see calculations running across her surface like words on a screen. A massive creature covered in thick blue fur was connected to 3 different computing machines at once, its multiple brains working together to process data at speeds that no human could match. The smoke being had expanded to fill an entire corner of the room, its form shifting and changing as it ran through millions of possible solutions simultaneously. And there was Kira, a small human with no special abilities, no neural enhancements, no species-specific gifts, nothing but a brain made of meat and water and electrical signals. She sat down in her usual seat in the back row and pulled out her tablet as she began to work through the problem step by step, the way she had been taught in every math and logic class she had ever taken. Hours passed, and she made almost no progress, because every time she thought she understood something, the puzzle twisted in a new direction and left her more confused than before. She watched the other students working, their alien minds processing information in ways she could not comprehend, and she felt a cold knot of despair growing in her stomach. This was hopeless. She would never catch up to them, never match their computational power, never prove that humans deserved a place among the stars. Kira put down her tablet and rubbed her eyes, and she sat there for a long moment, feeling sorry for herself and wondering why she had ever thought she could do this. And then, without really thinking about it, she reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. Paper was ancient technology on Earth, barely used anymore except by artists and old-fashioned people who liked the feel of it. But Kira had always loved the way it felt to write and draw by hand, and she had brought a small notebook with her as a comfort item from home. She stared at the Nexari problem floating above the central platform, and she began to sketch what she saw. Not the equations or the logic gates or the quantum states, but the shapes, the curves, the way the lines connected and flowed and twisted around each other. Her hand moved across the paper almost on its own, drawing without thinking, and she lost herself in the simple act of putting pencil to paper. Something strange began to happen as she drew. The more she sketched, the more the puzzle started to look familiar. Not like a computational problem at all, but like something she had seen before, something from her childhood that she had almost forgotten. She remembered sitting on her grandmother's lap on a warm summer afternoon, watching the old woman's hands work with string and thread, making patterns that seemed like magic to young Kira's eyes. "This is called a Celtic knot," her grandmother had said, her voice soft and kind. "And the trick to untangling it is to stop trying to follow every twist and turn, and instead look for where the pattern begins and where it ends." Kira's pencil stopped moving, and she stared at her sketch with new eyes. The Nexari problem was not a maze to be solved step by step. It was a knot, a vastly complex, multi-dimensional, quantum-entangled knot, but a knot all the same. And knots followed rules, patterns that repeated and connected in ways that could be seen if you knew how to look. She stood up so fast that her chair fell over behind her, and several students opened their eyes to stare at her in annoyance, but she did not care. She ran down the steps to the central platform, her paper clutched in her hand, and she stood before the holographic display and looked at it with fresh understanding. There! She could see where the pattern started now. A cluster of nodes in the upper left corner that connected to another cluster on the opposite side. And she could trace the flow of logic between them like following a thread through a tangle of yarn. And there, the recursive loops that had confused her so much were not random at all. They were echo patterns, the same shape repeated at different scales. Like a spiral shell or a fern leaf, or 100 other things from nature that Kira had seen without really noticing. Her grandmother had taught her another thing about knots, something that the computational minds of the other students would never think to try. Sometimes the fastest way to untangle a knot was not to pick at it strand by strand, but to find the right strand and pull, and the whole thing would come apart at once. Kira looked at her paper, then at the hologram, and she saw it. The key strand, the thread that held the entire knot together, hidden in plain sight among all the complexity. She walked to the submission terminal at the edge of the platform, and her hands were shaking as she began to enter a solution, not a step-by-step process, but a single elegant pull that would unravel the entire problem. 4 minutes and 37 seconds after she had stood up from her chair, Kira-chan pressed the submit button. The terminal was silent for a moment, and then it made a sound that Kira had never heard before. A chime that rang through the entire lecture hall like a bell announcing something important. Every student in the room stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. The holographic display of the next problem flickered once, twice, and then collapsed in on itself, the tangled knot coming apart strand by strand until nothing remained but empty air. Kira stood there, alone on the platform, holding her piece of paper with its simple sketch, and she did not understand what had just happened. The terminal screen showed 2 words that made no sense to her tired human brain. Solution accepted. And somewhere in his office across campus, Professor Vrethkon received an alert that would change everything he thought he knew about humans and their place in the galaxy. Professor Vrethkon was resting in his private chambers when the alert came through, and at first he thought there must be some kind of error in the system, because what the message said was simply not possible. Submission received. Student. Kira-chan time elapsed. 4 minutes. 37 seconds status. Solution ACCET. He read the message 3 times. His 4 compound eyes moving over each word, as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. And then he stood up so fast that he knocked over a shelf full of ancient mathematical texts that had taken him decades to collect. This was wrong. This was impossible. The Nexari problem had stood unsolved for 10,000 years, and the best minds in the galaxy had spent lifetimes trying to crack its secrets. And now some human student who had been at the institute for less than 2 days was claiming to have found a solution in less than 5 minutes. He ran through the corridors of the faculty building, his long legs carrying him faster than he had moved in years. And he burst into the main computational center, where 3 of his colleagues were working on their own research. "Look at this," he demanded, projecting the alert onto the main screen. "Tell me this is a system error. Tell me the machines have malfunctioned. Tell me anything that makes sense." Deishan Diend, a senior mathematician from the Phalari species, expanded her gaseous form to get a better look at the data, and her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "This is not an error," she said. "I can see the submission, I can see the solution, and I can see that it worked." "But how?" Breathcon demanded, his mandibles clicking frantically. "How could a human, a species that only discovered space travel 60 years ago, solve a problem that has defeated us for millennia?" Dr. Yeneth was already pulling up the details of the submission, and what she found made her form flicker with what might have been shock or might have been awe. She did not compute a solution, the Phalari scientist said slowly. She did not run calculations or process data or follow any methodology we would recognize. Then what did she do? She found a pattern. Breathcan stared at the screen, where the human solution was displayed in all its elegant simplicity, and he could not believe what he was seeing. The girl had not tried to solve the Nexari problem the way everyone else had, working through it step by step, processing each logic gate and quantum node in sequence. Instead, she had looked at the whole thing at once and seen something that no computational mind had ever noticed, an underlying structure that connected every part of the puzzle to every other part. And once she had seen that structure, the solution was obvious. "This is revolutionary," Dr. Yeneth said, her voice trembling with excitement. "This changes everything we thought we knew about computational theory." Breathcan did not respond because he was already running again, heading toward the lecture hall, where the human student had made her submission. When he arrived, he found the room in chaos. Students had abandoned their own calculations and gathered around the central platform, where Kira Chun stood alone, looking confused and a little frightened by all the attention. The crystal student Thessaly was demanding to see the solution, her perfect face twisted with something that looked like jealousy or disbelief. The smoke being had contracted into a tight ball of swirling darkness, and Breathcan could hear it muttering calculations under its breath, trying to understand what had happened. "Everyone be silent," the professor commanded, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade, and every student in the room felt quiet and turned to face him. He walked down the steps to the central platform, his eyes fixed on the small human woman who stood there with a piece of paper clutched in her hands. "Miss Chun," he said, and his voice was carefully controlled, "please explain to me what you did." Kira looked up at him with wide brown eyes, and she held out the paper like an offering. "I drew it," she said, and her voice was small and uncertain. "And when I drew it, I saw that it looked like a knot, like something my grandmother taught me how to untangle when I was a child." Breathcan took the paper and looked at it, and he saw a simple sketch. Lines and curves drawn by hand with a primitive tool. And yet somehow this crude drawing captured something essential about the Nexari, problem that all his years of study had missed. "A knot," he repeated, and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that his translator could not convert. "My grandmother always said that the trick to untangling a knot is to find the right thread and pull," Kira explained. "And when I looked at the problem that way, I could see which thread to pull." Word of what had happened was already spreading beyond the lecture hall. Faculty members were abandoning their classes to come see the human solution, and Breathcan's communication device was buzzing with messages from colleagues across the campus demanding information. Within an hour, the story had spread across the entire institute. Within a day, it had reached other worlds. News networks picked up the story, calling it the greatest mathematical breakthrough in thousands of years. And suddenly, everyone in the galaxy wanted to know about the human student who had done the impossible. Kira was overwhelmed by the attention. Hiding in her dormitory room while reporters and scientists and politicians sent her messages asking for interviews and explanations and proof that what she had done was real. But the most important message came from Professor Vrethkan himself, a simple request to meet with him in his office the following morning. Kira lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, wondering what the professor would say to her and whether she was in trouble for solving a problem she was not supposed to solve. She had come to the Galactic Institute to prove that humans belonged among the stars, and instead she had accidentally turned everything upside down. But as the three suns rose over the purple sky and painted her room in shades of gold and violet, Kira felt something new growing in her chest, something that felt a little like hope and a little like pride. She had done something that no one else had ever done, and even if she did not fully understand how, she knew that it mattered. And that was enough to give her the courage to face whatever came next. Kira walked through the corridors of the faculty building with her heart pounding in her chest, and she felt like every alien she passed was staring at her, whispering about her, wondering what made this small human so special. She reached the door to Professor Vrethkan's office and stood there for a long moment, gathering her courage, and then she raised her hand and knocked. "Enter," came the professor's deep voice, and Kira pushed open the door and stepped inside. The office was large and filled with strange objects from 100 different worlds. Crystals that glowed with inner light, machines that hummed with unknown purpose, and shelves upon shelves of books and tablets and scrolls that contained knowledge gathered over 2 centuries of study. But Kira barely noticed any of it because her attention was immediately captured by the beings who waited for her. Professor Vrethkan stood behind his desk, his 4 compound eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to run away. And beside him stood 3 other figures. One was Dr. Yeneth, the Falari scientist, whose gaseous form shifted and swirled with colors that Kira had never seen before. One was a tall being with silver skin and eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies, and Kira recognized her from news broadcasts as the Dean of Sciences, one of the most powerful academics in the known universe. And one was a small creature with too many limbs and a face covered in soft fur, who introduced herself as Dr. Mulax, a xenanthropologist who studied different species and how they thought. "Please sit down, Miss Chen," Professor Vrethkan said, gesturing to a chair that seemed to grow out of the floor to accommodate her human body. Kira sat, and she folded her hands in her lap to hide the fact that they were shaking. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, because she could not bear the suspense any longer. The Dean of Sciences made a sound that might have been a laugh, and her galaxy eyes sparkled with amusement. "Trouble?" she said, and her voice was like music played on instruments that had never existed. "My dear child, you have done something extraordinary, something that has not happened in thousands of years. I have spent the last day analyzing your solution," Dr. Yeneth added, her form flickering with excitement, "and I still cannot fully understand how you did it. But I know that it works, and that is what matters." Kira looked from one alien face to another, trying to read their expressions, trying to understand what was happening. "I do not really understand it either," she admitted. "I just saw a pattern, and I followed it." Professor Vrethkan clicked his mandibles and stepped around his desk to stand before her. And when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Miss Chun, I owe you an apology." Kira blinked in surprise, because this was the last thing she had expected to hear. "When you walked into my classroom 2 days ago, I looked at you and saw what everyone else sees when they look at humans," the professor continued. "A young species, primitive, barely worth noticing. Certainly not capable of competing with minds that have been evolving for millions of years." He paused, and his four eyes seemed to dim with something that looked almost like shame. I gave you the Nexari problem because I wanted to humble you, to show you that there are challenges in this universe that humans are simply not equipped to handle. But instead, the Dean of Sciences said, stepping forward, you humbled us. Dr. Melax, the xenanthropologist, held up a tablet that displayed images of human brains alongside diagrams of alien neural structures. I have been studying your species since the moment I heard what you did, she said, her many limbs gesturing excitedly, and I believe I understand what happened. She pulled up more images, showing scenes from human history, ancient hunters tracking prey across wide plains, early humans navigating through dense forests, children playing with puzzles and toys. Your species did not evolve to compute, Dr. Melax explained. You evolved to survive, and survival on your world required something different, something we computational species never developed. Pattern recognition, Kira said softly, finally beginning to understand. Exactly, the xenanthropologist exclaimed. Your brains are wired to see patterns everywhere, to recognize shapes and connections, to find meaning in chaos. Because that is what kept your ancestors alive when predators lurked in the shadows and food was hidden among the trees. Professor Vrethkan nodded slowly, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that Kira was beginning to recognize as deep thought. The Nexari were a computational species. Like most of the advanced civilizations in the galaxy, he said. They built their puzzle to be solved through calculation, through logic, through systematic analysis of every component. But they never imagined, the Dean of Sciences added, that someone might look at their masterpiece and see a knot, a simple tangle of thread that could be unraveled with a single pull. Kira sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of their words settle over her like a warm blanket. All her life, she had felt inferior to the aliens who sailed between the stars, who built wonders that humanity could barely comprehend, who had been exploring the universe since before her species had learned to walk upright. But now she understood that being different was not the same as being lesser. What happens now? She asked. Professor Vrethkan reached out and placed one of his clawed hands on her shoulder, and his touch was surprisingly gentle. Now we learn, he said. We learn from you, from your species, from the unique gift that evolution has given humanity. And we teach you, the Dean added, because your pattern recognition abilities are powerful. But they are not the only tools you will need to thrive in this galaxy. Together, Dr. Melax said, bouncing with excitement. Who knows what we might discover? Kira stood up from her chair and looked at the four alien beings who stood before her, and she felt something bloom in her chest. Something bigger than pride, bigger than hope. She felt like she belonged. I think, she said slowly, a smile spreading across her face, that humanity is going to do just fine among the stars. Professor Vrethkan clicked his mandibles in what Kira now recognized as approval, and his four eyes seemed to glow with warmth. I think, he replied, that the galaxy is not ready for what your species will become, Miss Chun, but I look forward to finding out. And as Kira walked out of the office and into the bright light of three suns, she knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and she was ready to explore every single one of them.